Great. Well, thanks so much for the great introduction, and Jim as well. And thank you so much for having me today. I love the series that you've put together, and think it's absolutely a great way to learn about so many career options. And I only wish I could be in Montana right now with everyone to have this conversation in person. Well, I know this is not a shy group, so please do feel free to put questions in the window. And if I don't see them as we go, then I'll look forward to answering them here after I give a bit of an open. So a little bit about me. As Jim mentioned and Matt mentioned, I'm Michael Mattmiller. I work in government affairs here at Microsoft. And coming to you today from a little bit closer to home. As folks know, Microsoft is one of the first companies here in Puget Sound to go to remote work as this pandemic began to take over our region. Um, Looking back at my career path, it's been a little interesting. And one of the messages I'd love to impart to the folks on this call is there is no one path to get where you want to go. And in fact, you may not even have a sense at this moment where it is that you ultimately want to take your career, but always be open to ideas and always be thinking about the way that you can apply your skill set in a way that solves a problem that someone may not even know that they have yet. So let me jump all the way back. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, just outside the city, in a suburb called Dublin. Went to high school there, and I was always technically inclined. I remember when I was 5 years old, I think my parents got me a Commodore 64. If anyone has ever seen one of those devices, a little beige computer that when you boot it up from a cassette drive, something that folks probably have not seen, you could write basic commands in the language called BASIC. I love the structured way of thinking about how one wrote computer code. And so at a young age, I started banging away on the keyboard and thought I would become a computer programmer. Fast forward throughout high school, was still very interested in technology. Went to college at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And from the outset, knew that my passion was how technology could improve the lives of others, how it could improve business. And so I went into a combined 5-year undergraduate business degree, Master's of Science Information Systems degree. Being in DC was a wonderful opportunity to get exposed to not only a bunch of brilliant individuals who all came with a passion to business school to learn and to think about that entrepreneurial perspective about how to go into the world and have impact, but it's also the seat of government in this country. And I told myself going in to GW that I like DC, I like this program, government's not for me. Could never be involved in government, never wanted to work in government or have anything to do with government. And then something funny happens. You meet people, you learn about problems to solve. And I learned very quickly that when you are dealing with how technology impacts citizens and how it impacts the world, it's hard to escape the scale of how the US government operates. If you think about something like healthcare, something that's top of mind for everyone right now, the United States government touches more than 1 billion health claims annually at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They process more than $1 trillion worth of healthcare claims. Being able to think about how technology can make that process more efficient and how technology can be optimized to improve health outcomes and the quality of care is pretty impactful. So I share that because I went through college with this mindset of government's not for me. But as I learned more, I thought, hey, there's something really interesting here. I also had a bit of a political bug. And throughout my time in college, had friends that were working on the Hill or were working for various different political organizations and nonprofits. And so from time to time, I would volunteer with them and had an opportunity to learn a little bit about how laws are made and think about how it is that one works to have influence in our system of government. So after I finished the undergraduate portion of my degree, I went to work for my university, for GW, developing systems that supported student life and the university's operations. It was a great experience because it gave me a chance to work with technology that not only people would use, but actually people around me were using every day. I built a content management system that served 5 million pages a month way back in Web 1.0. Not to date myself, but I remember sitting in the office the day that Google Maps came out, and we all kind of looked around and said, wow, this is really interesting. How did they make that work when Ajax was still a new concept? But it was a fantastic opportunity to learn and get hands-on. But I ultimately decided after a few years that writing code was not my lifelong passion. I was much more passionate about going in and figuring out problems that I knew technology could solve, and then having someone else do the heavy lift of turning that problem and a design and a vision into actual working technology. So from there, I went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And that's when my aversion to government began to break. As I mentioned before, there is something very alluring to think about the scale at which federal government operates, and if you can help the federal government and their systems be more efficient, the impact one can have on society. So I did go to work in PricewaterhouseCoopers' federal practice, where my clients were Medicare, my clients were Veterans Health Administration, these large government agencies that touched hundreds of millions of Americans. And so what I did at PwC was focus on how technology was secured, how it was governed, and how it aligned to mission. Really that notion of how do we more strategically use tech and make sure it's operating in a way that is secure and maintains the trust of the American public. Over time, my roles changed, and as I advanced in the organization, got to work on some really exciting projects. One of my favorites was with the Veterans Health Administration rolling out e-pharmacy transactions. So if you think about it, just to give you an example of what that means, we're all probably very used to going to the pharmacy, going to the drugstore, and getting a prescription drug when we're not feeling well. It used to be that our doctor handed us a prescription, we handed it to the pharmacist, they filled it, they typed some things in their system, handed us a drug, and we paid a co-payment, and then the pharmacist billed an insurance company to cover the rest of the cost. Well, in the mid-2000s, the Department of Veterans Affairs had not gone to those electronic transactions. If you wanted a prescription filled and you were a veteran, you brought your piece of paper, the pharmacist filled it, they filled out a long form, that form got mailed to your insurance company, the insurance company adjudicated it, sent a form back to VA. As you can imagine, this is taking time, it's inefficient, and VA was sending more than one tractor trailer load of claims every month just to one insurance company, to a company called Caremark. And so Caremark said, wait a second, why is the federal government so inefficient when it was just a few years prior that the federal government had passed this law you may have heard of called HIPAA that required administrative efficiency? So Caremark sued. And all of a sudden, VA realized we had to get better. Well, when you're at the federal government scale, change can be very hard. And they had more than 500 pharmacies across the nation, 7 mail order pharmacies. It was a huge scale. And not only did they have to figure out how to turn the ship, as it were, and make pharmacy transactions electronic, but they had to help educate all of their staff about what it meant to now bill pharmacy transactions electronically. And they had to educate their tens of millions of veterans who rely on the Veterans Administration to get their drugs. And so what my team did is we focused on that change management process, or I should say the team that I was on focused on that change management process holistically. And it was fascinating to watch the experts we brought to the table who helped think about educating the staff, educating the veterans. What does that communications plan look like? And from a technology end, we worked very closely with the teams who are coding changes to the Veterans Affairs custom system to make that all work. What my team did, I was particularly proud of. We worked on measuring how efficient and how accurate VA was at billing those healthcare claims or those pharmacy claims. And what we learned very quickly is that because this is a new concept to VA staff, there were just some things that were getting missed, some things that other pharmacies that have been doing this process for a long time were good at. When a claim got rejected, figuring out why and rebilling it. When an error came up, understanding what that error meant and giving instruction on how to fix it. So long story short, through this project, my team was able to go in analyze the situation, work with pharmacists, work with a large group of stakeholders, and found tens of millions of dollars that were being left on the table, dollars that could be recouped from insurance companies and go to help veterans um, every single day and go right back into their care. And so ultimately, we had a tremendous return on what was a very small contract to help VA and improve the quality of care, really provided great benefit to veterans. And in my mind, that was one of the more pivotal experiences of my early career because it helped me see that when we talk about technology, we're not just talking about lines of code. We're not talking about cool new features on devices or on a computer or a smartphone, even though, don't get me wrong, I love cool new features on devices and smartphones, but we actually do impact people's lives. And that experience was very critical to me deciding what I wanted to do next. Yeah. At some point, we moved out to Seattle. I was commuting back and forth to DC, continuing to work with Veterans Affairs and some other federal clients. And um, I just got a text, I'm sorry, from Ben Hamill. If someone is on the call who knows Ben Hamill, he just closed the dot that you're on the call. So hi to the Hamill family. Um, what was I saying? So I moved out to Seattle. I was commuting back and forth to DC, continuing to work with federal agencies. And at some point I said, I'd really love to stay local and figure out how to have impact. And that's when one of my clients, Microsoft, was having issues making their technology secure enough to sell to the federal government, a standard that some folks may be familiar with called FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. So I decided, you know what, it's time for a change. And I went to Microsoft to help the company define its enterprise cloud privacy and security story and to prepare to meet federal requirements. It was a fantastic effort, again, to think about how it was we were taking really cool new tech and make sure that the government could trust it so that it could benefit the citizens of the country. I'll admit I was only doing that for a short period when the political bug that I was so familiar with in DC came back into my life. When a candidate for mayor here in Seattle said, hey, really need your help thinking about how we improve the city using technology. And that candidate ultimately was elected mayor in 2013. And he asked me to come in and help assess how technology was serving the city. I came in, met with members of the outgoing mayor's administration, met with some of the departments, and found some really interesting challenges that should be addressed if this mayor was going to carry out his agenda of making Seattle a livable, affordable, inclusive community for all. So I presented the mayor with my proposed recommendations of how to improve the city's function or operations using tech and how tech should work in the community. And based on that, the mayor asked me to come on board as his chief technology officer. And in Seattle, they have a blended role. Some folks may know that a CIO, a chief information officer, tends to work on enterprise systems and systems that support the business of an organization versus a technology officer that's more focused on architecture and roadmaps and that vision piece of where technology is going. So in 2014, I came and joined Mayor Murray's administration here in Seattle as the CTO for the city. And what that meant is that I and my team really looked at how it is that we enabled city efficiency, how we made sure that as new tech was coming out, that city departments were able to benefit from it, both in terms of how they operated and the cool new things they could do with it. But also we took a look at how technology impacted equity in the city. And this is a topic that is so very important to the moment in which we find ourselves. How is it that people in the city of Seattle are using the internet to further themselves, to further their economic situation, their education? Do they have access to a device? Do they have access to broadband internet? And so this position gave me an opportunity to go beyond what I had learned in my time in business school, in my time at PwC, of taking business needs and aligning tech to reach some type of outcome, whether it was efficiency or productivity, and really focus then on the community as well. So I'll just share a couple examples real quick of my favorite moments in city. One of the things on the more CIO side that we did is we took a look across how IT was structured in the city of Seattle. And what we learned is that even though the city of Seattle was a highly consolidated organization where you had about 13,000 employees, 8,000 of them sat in the same physical location, we had very clear definition around the 29 core business processes of the city, and we had support of our leaders, what we found is that there were actually 15 different IT departments operating in the city, each with their own mandates, their own budgets, their own authority, even though in the city laws in our Seattle Municipal Code, it said that the CTO was accountable for the decisions made by these 15 teams, even though they had no authority to coordinate with each other. I know that sounds bureaucratic, but for those of you who are entrepreneurial and think about how important it is to be able to move fast and have clarity of vision and really be able to have the systems in place and metrics to monitor performance, none of that existed. And so we all stepped back. We inventoried the 15 teams. We found 1,300 enterprise applications, some of which were actually in conflict with each other, that were involved in running the city. And we started to ask questions. We said, well, how much money are we spending to run systems versus how much money are we spending to improve outcomes for the public? If I am a resident of the city of Seattle, how many different departments do I have to go to if, say, I move and I want to change my address on file with the city? How many departments do I have to talk to if I want a building permit or a library card or to register my pet with the pet shelter? What we found as we asked those questions is that the answers were pretty challenging. You, in some cases, had to talk to 7 different departments if you wanted to change your address. You had to register, I think it was something like 4 or 5 different websites just to get a standard set of updates from the Parks Department on what was happening in your neighborhood. And so we realized we needed an imperative for change. And we did that. We put together a business case. We brought the city council together. We brought department directors together, and we created the imperative for a new centralized IT department. That meant creating a new city or a new organization within the city. It was the largest reorganization in 15 years of city history. And today, the Seattle IT department, with its budget of $250 million and about 750 staff, is engaged in mission-driven service and improving the quality of life for all Seattleites through the use of technology. One of the great things about consolidating was not just creating a new bureaucratic structure, but the realization when we brought people together and we had one common mission, that all of a sudden we realized we were over capacity in some areas in terms of headcount and staff, and we were under-resourced in others. So we were able to better allocate our resources to invest in new technology projects and new strategies and new services without having to go and request new money from the taxpayers. And in some cases, we were actually able to return money to the taxpayers by cutting budgets where we were spending too much on duplicative systems. So that was a great program that we got to work on. The other program that I'll share that I'm very proud of from the city is our work related to broadband. When we came into this new administration, we looked at across the city, and what we said was, are people in Seattle benefiting from the internet? Are they able to get online? And what we learned is that Seattle is very lucky. At the time that we came into office, I believe something like 83 or 84% of people in the city of Seattle could get access to the internet if they wanted it. And yet, we noticed a large number of people were choosing not to subscribe to the internet. So we did some research. We talked to a number of community groups. And what we learned is that even though a lot of people in the city could get access to broadband, there were structural barriers to actually subscribing to the service. For some families, the cost of the internet was too great, and so they chose not to get online. In some communities and families, what we learned is that parents were working 1, 2, 3 jobs, and so to take off an afternoon while the cable company or the phone company came to install internet access was prohibitive, and therefore the family couldn't get online. We also learned that in some cases, there was an issue where parents didn't understand why their family needed internet. These were adults who had never worked in an information job. Perhaps they were of a generation that didn't use technology. They had never used technology. And so they just didn't see the value and the reason to spend money. So we formed a team within the city to begin tackling these issues. We worked with the cable and the phone companies to create discounted internet programs so that it could be more affordable for families that had cost issues. We worked with the companies to create self-installation kits, or to increase the availability of self-installation kits so that time didn't become a barrier to getting online. And we also worked with a number of nonprofit and trusted community organizations to help educate why it's so important just like everyone on this call knows right now, for children and teenagers to get online, to work on homework, to learn, and to have that competitive advantage in their education to get ahead as they think about future employment in college. We also recognize that the city itself had perhaps been a disincentive to making internet service better and cheaper in the city. We spoke with a number of internet service providers who told us that the city's regulatory burden was so great that it disincentivized investment in new broadband service in the city. As many of the entrepreneurs on this call know, one of the problems when there is an idea for a great business or a desire to pursue a market opportunity is when there's an imbalance between the government's good intentions to create rules and when those rules go too far to block entrepreneurial thinking. So what we did is we worked closely with community stakeholders, with our city council, and with actual individuals in our communities, homeowners, and those who were driving regulation to say, how is it we can come up with common sense rules to allow new fiber optic infrastructure to be built in our city, to provide the latest generation of broadband internet, and still give people trust that ugly new infrastructure isn't going to take over their neighborhoods. And through that effort, we were able to rewrite the city's ordinance that governed internet service from 60 pages down to 14 pages. We were able to incent our phone company to overbuild the city. 80% of the city was able to get fiber optic internet service. And then the two cable companies in our city saw the need to remain competitive, so they began to improve their infrastructure. And as a result of all of this work, at the end of the day, when we left office, the city now has 99.9% internet service, broadband internet availability. Close to 94% of the city subscribes to internet service. Prices decreased, speeds increased, and customer service increased. And we saw, even at the lower income levels where price had been a real challenge, that community had significantly increased their broadband access and adoption rates. So again, looking at how that technology is not just about a cool new feature, but really changing people's lives. You know, when I left the city, I thought, how can I continue to have impact? And that's what took me back to Microsoft. I love the company. I had seen all the great new things that our CEO, Satya Nadella, was doing since I left the company, and said, gosh, it would be great to go back. But I don't want to be back at a desk looking at internal systems and process. I really want to continue that work of thinking how it is tech impacts society and the role the company can play and having a positive impact. And that's what took me to government affairs. Today, what I do is I work with a handful of states, including Montana, to think about how it is technology is changing society and the positive influence tech can play. It's one of the reasons that in Montana, I've worked with several ISPs to help increase broadband access through a program called Microsoft Airband. It's why during legislative season, we've helped work with legislators to think about new bills that could enable innovation while giving the public trust that they could use new technology in a way that respects their privacy. Beyond my work in my states, I also take point on how it is we think about using technology to help state and local government and make sure that we are working with governors and legislators and other electeds from across the country to understand that way that technology can help them be successful as they develop and carry out their agendas. So I've been back with the company now, I think it's been about 2 years, and having a wonderful time. But if you had gone back to the Michael Mattmiller, who was just getting to college in DC a fair number of years ago now, and said, hey, that mental barrier you've created for yourself that you can't work in government, you can't work with government, it's not for you, it's not business friendly, it's not entrepreneurial. I think that Michael would be very surprised to see where I ended up, but I'm so glad I'm here now. And I hope that that's a good backgrounder. I'd love to hear your questions or thoughts about my career path or how you think about government or how you think about the way technology is changing the way government operates. So Matt, back to you.
That's great, Michael. This is Matt. Thank you so much. I've got a couple questions here that have come in via chat. Some of them are related to the scale of working with the U.S. government or working for a Microsoft corporation or even a city of Seattle, because Montana, we're we're rural, right? And even our urban areas are rural. Can you can you talk a little bit about what you do on a day-to-day basis for Microsoft in government relations?
Sure. I know this will sound cliche and something you probably hear from all your guest speakers, but there is no normal of a day in this role. And even here in the pandemic, I'm learning that that's the case. Typically, when I think about what my day looks like, it depends first on the time of year. Um, in a month like May, where many state legislatures are adjourned, I'm going to Helena and I'm meeting with folks on the governor's team or with legislators. I try and make it out to Missoula and Billings once a quarter to catch up. And I'm doing two things primarily. First off, I'm listening. What's going on in communities? What are the leaders of the state thinking about? What are they experiencing? Um, and trying to see if I or Microsoft can bring a point of view to help them. And it's very rarely about technology. I think about a couple of years ago in Montana, it was about Medicaid expansion and how is the state going to pay for that. Um, well, part of the answer could be how efficient is the state in um, how they adjudicate claims and the systems they use to expand. Getting more efficient isn't going to pay for the entire cost of Medicaid expansion, but maybe it helps. Um, I also really find it interesting to hear what personal concerns residents around the state are having. And this is something that Matt and Bridger and Todd and all the great folks at the chamber helped me do as well. I love reading the newsletters and getting to meetings to hear, what is it about Montana that makes it unique? For example, we know that Montana is perhaps the most entrepreneurial state in the nation, and yet the success rate of Montana businesses does not match what we see in other states. I believe it's MSU that's done some research into this, and finding those reasons and thinking about from a policy perspective, are there additional ways the state could be helpful to make those businesses more successful? And by the way, does that mean that we need more government resources? Does that mean that we need, as a technology company at Microsoft, to be thinking about new services we can provide to help businesses succeed? All things that I love listening to, going back to my colleagues at Microsoft, asking questions, seeing what we can do, and making sure we're showing up in a way that's helpful. During legislative session, or I should say even as, we're going to see in Montana come November when we elect a new governor, part of what I do is make sure that I help inform our electeds about what's going on around the country. What are the best practices when it comes to a government, planning a new service, planning for transition, and how it is technology can enable better service to citizens. So, for example, right now I'm helping to lead a task force for the Council of State Governments, or I should say, I'm advising a task force that a couple of Montana legislators are participating in. And this task force is called the Future of Work. So when we look ahead a few years, what will it mean to work in state government, and what tools will employees need to be successful? Beyond tools, what strategies do state leaders need to implement to make sure we get the right talent into state government? And what policies do we need in place to make sure that government is operating efficiently? It's a really great task force. And having worked in government at the city, I'm able to bring a point of view around what works when it comes to workforce development. What are the barriers we're going to face as we think about developing that next round of government leaders on the civil service side? So part of my day is spent joining those types of conversations and developing written material to inform the work of those committees. So I know I bounced around a bit there, but those are just some of the things that I'll do in any given day, things like that.
You're speaking our language with entrepreneurship and workforce development, Michael. So thank you for those points. Access to broadband is something that comes up constantly in the state of Montana. Can you talk a little bit about how you incentivize those broadband providers in your role at Seattle to improve not only the quality, but then also able to bring down the price?
Yeah. What's interesting about broadband is that it is generally unregulated. And I say that at a macro level. Some may have seen the back and forth over the past 10 years on something called net neutrality. In other words, how is it that our federal government, or more specifically the FCC, treats broadband service providers from a regulatory perspective? There is this idea that they should be like a phone company, a Title I service. And that means that there'd be a lot of requirements the federal government could attach to say, you can't throttle services, you can't prioritize certain types of traffic. And by the way, we can tell you who you have to serve. Um, that is not the regulatory structure where the federal government landed. Instead, internet is considered a Title II information service, where there is very little direction governments can provide about how internet service rolls out. So in the city of Seattle, what we try to think about is first, what is our regulatory authority to require internet service providers to serve everyone in our community? What regulatory authority do we have to set prices? And in absence of those things, how do we nudge our companies or incent them to do what we think is best? So from a regulatory side, what we realized is, well, we can't regulate internet service, but the federal government has given cities franchising authority to regulate cable television providers, or what the FCC calls a Title VI video service. I won't bore you with all the great details, but basically, at the time, our phone company wanted to start selling a video service, become a cable provider. And so that was the business entrepreneurial decision that they had made and what they wanted to do. So they had something they needed from the city, a franchise. At the same time, we had an incumbent cable provider that wanted to make sure that their investments they made were recognized and that they wanted to have this new challenger be on a level playing field. So as we looked to reform our regulatory structure to give this new player access to maintain some parity for the incumbent, we had some, I guess you'd say, bargaining power or negotiating power to say, well, to make all these changes, we're going to ask for some informal commitments. We don't have legal authority to require you to do things, but we really think that you want to do what's best for our community, and we want to help you do that. And so by recognizing that moment in time and that power that we had, we were able to help our companies voluntarily make commitments related to providing low-income discounted services, to building out in some parts of the city that they didn't previously serve. And we did have a little bit of regulatory authority in that space. And as a result, that's how we're able to achieve some really great outcomes of making sure the new fiber optic build from our phone company served the vast majority of the city, that it didn't discriminate based on income levels within certain neighborhoods, and that all Seattleites could really benefit from the changes coming in technology. And so for the folks on the call who I know are really thinking about entrepreneurship and business savvy, don't discount the role that government plays and the impact that you can have in government by applying that same mindset and thinking, not only to the way government operates, but also to how it is we help the business community achieve their desired outcomes while keeping public policy imperatives like internet service for all in mind.
Awesome answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to take you back now. You mentioned that during high school you were a bit technically inclined, right? And you had some of those very first computers. Can you talk a little bit more about your high school experience? I know you were adverse to working in government at all, but can you talk about clubs and the subjects interests in any sports and anything that what your high school experience was like as you prepared to go off to the East Coast?
Sure. I was horribly awkward in high school. I'll readily admit that. It took me a while to come into a friend group and into an experience where I felt comfortable being myself. Um, in terms of classes, I did gravitate towards the applied electives, the business classes, the coding classes, to choir and drama classes filled my schedule. But in terms of my main focus extracurricularly in high school, it was yearbook. I really enjoyed graphic design, the little bit of coding that I could bring into that. And that's where I found my niche and my leadership role in the school. So I was editor my senior year, worked on yearbook from sixth grade all the way through graduation. And it's interesting. While I'm very proud of the editorial work that we did in producing quality stories and photography and great publications, and our senior book was recognized with several awards. I'm also very proud of the business skill that went into producing the book. It's been so long, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but when I started working on my high school yearbook in ninth grade, I remember that our cash reserves were a couple $1,000s every year. And when I graduated, we had built up cash reserves to about 40,000. We had gone to an all color book from a black and white book my freshman year. And we had really set up the next generation of folks coming in to be successful doing some cool new things with tech that we wouldn't have been able to afford a few years prior. So it's interesting what one remembers from high school many years later, but I hope that's illustrative.
That's a great entrepreneurial success story.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. What I heard you talking a lot about through your intro was business process optimization, right? That's the term I guess you would use in the real world. Um, can you talk to the high school students on here about if this process optimization is something that interests them, what are things that they could be studying or experiments that they could be making in their own lives to improve processes?
That's a great question. And I love the fact that there are folks on this call that would be thinking about that business process optimization. And at any age, but especially for this group, my first advice is just always be curious. Always be asking questions, whether aloud or to yourself, about how something works, about why something is happening the way it is, and being open when you find that thing that just really catches you about, that's interesting, or I want to learn more, about taking the moment to go do a quick Wikipedia search, or to find a book on the topic, or to ask someone, how they learned about that topic, or who you could talk to learn more. You'd be surprised later on, or even now, how having some of that background knowledge about basic business process or aspects of certain industries comes back to be useful. I'll say even now, the fact that I can sit down with an elected and be ready to talk about everything from how the dairy industry is doing up in or I should say north of Missoula, to how it is that Colstrip is faring as we change our energy sources, is because over the years I've taken the time to read and learn more. But back to the question specifically, how does one get up to speed on business process? Well, I'd say that never, when you have that interest, first and foremost, try and find someone who is responsible for that business process. And by that I mean, let's say, and I'll use a government example because it's a classic one. Let's say you wonder how law enforcement does their job. How is it that a police department assigns beat officers to certain locations? How is it that they go about measuring and ensuring the safety of a community? Well, typically what one can do is go to their police department and say, well, I'd like to go on a ride along. I would love to be able to go out with an officer for a few hours and just observe how they do their job, ask questions, and to develop that understanding of the business process of law enforcement. When I went to the city, I performed that same type of ride along with a number of departments and a number of our lines of business, so I could develop that sensitivity to both how they worked and to begin to develop my own understanding of where there might be improvements. Of course, that's a very qualitative experience, but one that you can do in most any type of company or any type of industry. There are more quantitative metrics that one can use, and that would be more around the benchmarking. So how is it that you can take a look at a business process, do some research to say, well, what are the best practices? How classically does this process work? From a metrics perspective, if it's, say, producing a widget and there's some activity-based costing, what is the cost to produce that widget versus other similar industries or other similar companies that do the same work? And so I think that there are those types of tools that is, once that is business process optimization, you can learn that combination of the metrics and the tools to evaluate specific processes distinct to an industry versus what are those qualitative ways to learn and gather information, and then synthesize that to come up with a point of view around what could be improved. For folks on this call that is an interest, one of my favorite things is to read Harvard Business Review. It's always fascinating to look at the case studies where they delve into a number of different changes in organizations and society and bring that analytical lens. I imagine for folks on the phone who will be going on to business school, you'll spend a lot of time reading and evaluating case studies, and it's good fun. So getting used to that now is a great skill to learn. but never be afraid to just ask business leaders or others who are you seeing doing interesting things to jump in and develop your point of view now.
Perfect segue into our next question. How do you choose a mentor?
That's a tough one. Um, I've always been very lucky to work with incredibly smart folks who I respect and who have always been very open to me coming to them for advice. I have not in my career, I very rarely in my career been so formal as to say, hey, will you be my mentor? But instead, working for firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers or Microsoft in particular, I've had a great opportunity um, to talk to folks about their experience. How did they navigate life in their firm? How did their career grow? And when I find someone who has done some really interesting things that resonate with me, or I see has reached a level of success that I would like to emulate, I've asked if it would be okay to put recurring time on their calendar and to periodically get their feedback on my performance or to get advice about where to go next. And generally, folks have been very open to that. So in picking a mentor, I would say number one, find someone where you have a natural relationship. I find that if there's an affinity, the mentor is both more likely to care about you and make time, but also that it'll be more fulfilling and that you'll feel more comfortable going to access them. I would also say, find a mentor who cares. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but I remember reading a study from McKinsey, it's been a few years ago now, that looked at coaching and development types of scenarios in both companies as well as informal mentorship in business schools. And one of the strongest success criteria for satisfaction in the mentor-mentee relationship is that the mentor actively cared about developing their mentee and took pride and wanted to actually improve that skill set themselves. So I would also be totally candid with someone that I wanted to mentor me and say, hey, is this something that you're actually interested in, not just checking a box? In terms of where you find those mentors, if you're not already in a role, I will admit that I'm not too familiar with the options within Montana, but I think about Matt, if I'm not speaking out of school, organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, where you have leaders who are coming together because they want to improve their community, both to be a better business climate, but also for the betterment of everyone who lives in the state, are great places to look and to seek ideas. So whether it's the state Montana Chamber or its local chambers, looking at who the business leaders are, those people who are already committed to giving back, is a great way to network and to learn, as well as to think about the family, friends, and connections that you may have. Who do you see doing interesting things in your community, or who perhaps graduated a few years ago that has gone off to work in some interesting role, whether in the state or perhaps elsewhere, and ask them how they got there. And if you like what you hear, ask if you can check in periodically and just have that great informal mentoring relationship.
That was a great answer, Michael. Thank you. All right, I've got a very specific question here regarding the yearbook.
Mm.
Okay, so the entrepreneurial spirit that you put into that, to go from a couple $1,000s of reserves when you started to, you said, I believe, $40,000 or so. Can you talk a little bit about some of the techniques or strategies that you used, if you can remember to do that?
Yes, and isn't it just, gosh, it's funny the things that stick out in your brain from high school. I remember early on in my time on the yearbook as a freshman, and I was very fortunate that the leaders of the yearbook I'd actually been on middle school yearbook with. So one, there was a trusted relationship to interesting, zany ideas. I think my initial observation was that we were underpricing our product. I had the good fortune and privilege to come from a community that had means, and we were pricing our yearbook just about at cost. And my first observation was, well, why is it that we have this cyclical process where we can't pay our bills, but we know our community sees the importance of this product and they could afford to chip in a few extra bucks? So step one was to raise the price, because I recognized that we had an inelastic market, as the economists on the phone might say. From there, it became this conversation of, well, let's look at the product itself. We have a community that is expecting a solid premium product, and yet we're giving a very cookie cutter product in terms of templates that a national company put out. We weren't really investing in the quality of the copy and the journalism and the photography. And by the way, this was, not terribly modern times, but it was still the 90s. And hey, we're still putting out a book in black and white when the cost to produce color has dramatically decreased. So after we increased prices, we decided to put some portion of that price increase back into improving the products, paying student photographers to go out and take better pictures, to improving the journalism standards of the program so that we actually made it a credit-bearing course to produce the yearbook, but there would be then evaluation of the content that students were creating. And those two things started to bear fruit in my sophomore yearbook, where we were able, I think at that point, we got up to about 50% color in the book. We started putting editorial content. We went off to several national competitions and were recognized in a couple categories. And then we just repeated that play over the next 3 years until senior year, it was all color and all, well, I should say we did well for ourselves in several competitions and it built up that reserve. So assessing the market, adjusting the product accordingly, and then executing would be the answer.
That's awesome. A couple educators have asked if we can maybe pull that out for a public service announcement so they can get more kids interested in the yearbook in their school.
Happy to take that offline and do a PSA on yearbook.
Okay, this is going to be the last question for you, Michael. We're right at 50 minutes right now. And we have a question. What kind of drama were you interested in? What kind of acting were you interested in?
Oh, gosh. What type of drama was I? So I was in drama club and took both the theater, tech, and the performance classes in high school. I think that I never envisioned for myself a Broadway career, as my classmates may have. And actually, one of my classmates, Jeremy Bobb, has gone off to do quite a bit of Broadway and is, I can't think of which Netflix show he is now headlining, but he has done well for himself. So we had a good program. I think for me, it was finding a creative outlet and energy, as well as that sense of belonging that I know can be very challenging to find in high school. And that's where sometimes, more so than the subject at hand, it's the relationships and the sense of belonging an individual can feel that turns into an interest or perhaps even a career path. I think for me that belonging then gave me the credibility and the comfort to work on things like the yearbook and to make decisions and to be recognized as someone who was connected to the administration and was involved in their school community in a way that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise. I also think that those relationships do create the social constructs that lead to other things. When I went off to college, because I had been involved in drama in high school, I naturally started to gravitate towards the drama clubs and societies at GW. And while that was great and it was a wonderful way to make friends, I very quickly pivoted to say, oh, now that there's this broader assortment of classes that I can learn from, and there's this much broader DC community where I can connect, I pivoted to those interests that were more aligned to my career pursuits. Not to say that it wasn't valuable to be involved in drama, specifically to the roles and things I was interested in. Loved musicals. I was, I will not bore you with all the roles actually, but was Nicely Johnson and Guys and Dolls Senior. I think that was the most fun one. But it is a tremendous type of investment of time, and if that's your passion, go for it, and never be afraid to invest time and energy and effort into what might be perceived as a hobby or not something that is, on the absolute right path for your career. Because again, those experiences that you have and the knowledge you gain, and even the knowledge of how to navigate interpersonal relationships and leadership skills that you develop, all of that can happen in a hobby or something that you just want to do for yourself, even if it may not intuitively add up to, well, that's going to get me the next step in my business or my career.
Michael, that I think is a great place to end it. I think that's great advice to leave our high school students and their educators with. Again, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. We'll make this available and share it with you. And I hope to see you in Lewistown in June. Is that correct?
I so hope that I can be there in Lewistown because I have not been and I hear it's amazing. That said, I'm not sure if our respective state departments of health will want me to travel across state lines in
Okay.
mid-June. But hey, if Department of Health says it's okay, I will be there.
Awesome. Well, we'll keep you updated. Thank you, everyone that's joined us for Michael Mattmiller from Microsoft. Before you drop off, if you haven't done so yet, please type in your name, your school name, and your educator into the chat box so we can keep a record of everyone that was on here. Again, Michael, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your week, and I hope to see you in June in Lewistown.
Sounds great. Well, thank you everyone for the time.
Bye.